The courtroom was silent as 9-year-old Lily Blake stood up, her voice cutting through the tension. "I saw it," she declared, eyes fixed on the judge. Everyone believed her father was guilty, but then, with one sentence, Lily revealed a shocking truth. She pointed at Samuel Grant, a man no one had seen before. The room froze. What happened next would leave everyone in disbelief. But let's start from the beginning. The courtroom was suffocating in its stillness as Judge Parker, a stern man in his mid-50s, sat behind the bench. His face was grim, his posture rigid as he stared down at the papers before him. The tension was thick, palpable, like a storm ready to break. On trial was Thomas Blake, a father of 2, accused of assaulting his neighbor, Mr. Harris. The evidence seemed damning. Bloodied clothing, a witness who swore Thomas had been seen near the scene, and an unprovable alibi. It all pointed to one thing: guilt. Thomas, usually a strong, dependable figure, now looked like a shell of himself. His broad shoulders were hunched, his eyes downcast, and his hands shook slightly in his lap. The weight of the accusations pressed down on him like a physical force. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, the judgment, the doubt. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his voice had betrayed him, lost somewhere in the sea of hopelessness. Beside him, his 9-year-old daughter Lily sat quietly, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. Despite her usual reserved nature, there was something different in her gaze today, something fierce. She had never been one to speak out, to raise her voice, but today, as the prosecutor, Ms. Jenkins, called forth her next witness, something stirred inside her. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for the next piece of damning evidence. But instead, there was a sudden shift, a small figure standing up. Lily. The room fell even quieter as she gripped the edges of the chair, her eyes locked onto Judge Parker. Her voice, soft but filled with conviction, broke the silence. "I saw it," she said. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "I saw Mr. Harris." She paused, her small chest rising with a breath of determination. "He wasn't alone that night." A collective gasp swept through the room. Everyone turned to look at her, their attention now fixed on the little girl who had just altered the course of the trial. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable, as Lily stood tall, her quiet voice echoing louder than the accusations made against her father. A murmur spread through the courtroom like a ripple on water. The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Parker leaned forward, his brows furrowed in interest. For a moment the tension was so thick that it felt as if time itself had slowed. Ms. Jenkins, the prosecutor, glanced at Lily with visible disdain, as if she was about to brush the girl aside. But Lily stood her ground. She wasn't afraid. The words she had been holding back for so long were finally pouring out. Lily's voice was steady as she began to recount the events of that night. Her innocence gave weight to the clarity of her memory, each detail sharp and precise. She spoke of the dark street, the faint sound of heated voices. She had been watching from the window, her small face pressed against the cool glass. And then she saw Mr. Harris, the very man accusing her father, engaged in a fierce conversation with a man she had never seen before. Her words cut through the room, vivid and unexpected. The people listening, expecting more confusion or rambling from a child, were stunned. They had heard nothing like this before. The room grew colder as the details emerged, the picture coming into sharper focus. Mr. Harris wasn't alone. There had been someone with him, a man whose presence was completely unknown to the court. Judge Parker, his skepticism hanging in the air, glanced quickly toward the defense attorney, Mr. Carter. Both men were taken aback, the surprise on their faces evident. They had expected a child's testimony to be unreliable, an unsubstantiated claim. But Lily was unshaken, her eyes firm as she continued. The man's face had been partially hidden, Lily explained, the shadows of the night obscuring his features. But Lily had seen enough. There was something about him that had stuck with her, something she couldn't shake. Her finger pointed to a man seated in the back of the room. The air in the courtroom seemed to still for a moment as all eyes turned to him. The room exploded with disbelief as the man's identity was revealed. It was Samuel Grant, a criminal with a long history, someone whose name had been whispered in the darkest corners of the city. The gasps were so loud they seemed to echo off the walls. Everyone in the room had just been blindsided, and Lily, a small girl, had just uncovered the truth. With Lily's testimony hanging in the air, the defense team sprang into action without hesitation. They moved quickly, organizing their strategy, ready to tear apart the case that had seemed so solid just moments ago. The prosecutor, Ms. Jenkins, stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. The confident, smug expression that had dominated her throughout the trial had vanished, replaced by a dawning realization that everything she had worked for had just crumbled. As the court called for a brief recess, the police were already on the move. Samuel Grant, the man Lily had so bravely identified, was apprehended without resistance. His arrest sent a ripple through the courtroom, but the real impact would be felt in the hours to come. Within a short time, new evidence surfaced, each piece more damning than the last. Investigations revealed that Grant had been conspiring with Mr. Harris, setting up Thomas Blake as a scapegoat. The scheme had been meticulously planned. An innocent man was about to be convicted for a crime he didn't commit. As the courtroom reconvened, the mood had shifted dramatically. What had once been a sea of uncertainty and suspicion now swelled with anger. The revelation of the conspiracy was a blow to the integrity of the entire trial. Ms. Jenkins, whose earlier demeanor had been one of confidence and superiority, now stood pale, her hands shaking. She had no answers, no defense. Her carefully constructed case had unraveled before her eyes, and the weight of that failure settled on her shoulders. Judge Parker, his usually unshakable composure now visibly strained, sat back in his chair, his face reddened with frustration and disbelief. He had been on the verge of condemning an innocent man, convinced by the lies and manipulation that had been so expertly crafted. Now the truth stood before him, undeniable and unforgiving. The judge, a man who had presided over countless trials, found himself questioning the very system he had sworn to uphold. In that moment, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him, and the full extent of the injustice that had nearly occurred hit him like a hammer. In the final moments of the trial, as all the evidence was laid bare, Judge Parker, looking deeply moved, declared Thomas Blake innocent. The applause that erupted in the courtroom felt like a release, the pent-up tension finally breaking. Lily, the brave little girl, had single-handedly saved her father. As the family embraced, there was a feeling of triumph not just for Thomas, but for truth and justice. Judge Parker, usually so composed, stood up, his voice choked with emotion as he addressed the courtroom. Never underestimate the power of truth, no matter how small the voice that carries it. The Blakes left the courtroom, their hearts full, knowing that they had fought the good fight. The judge, still in shock, would remember this day for the rest of his life. A day when justice had been truly served.